EVN routing with OSPF version 2. In this video, I'm going to show you how we can configure routing of EVN, Easy Virtual Network, with OSPF Open Shortest Path First version 2. It's so similar to the configuration of OSPF in VRF Lite environment, but here we can review the configuration of OSPF in the EVN. First, we should configure this scenario. This scenario is the same scenario of the previous video I configured with the RIP version 2. Because of that, I have the configuration and I'm using the same configuration for this scenario. Let me to review the configuration of R1. Here R1 connected to 3 VRF, VRF-A, VRF-B and VRF-C, and also R2. As you can see, I configured the host name as R1, the VRF definition A, VNet tag 2, address family IPv4 unicast, okay? Then VRF definition B, VNet tag 3, address family IPv4 unicast, and then VRF definition C, VNet tag 4, and address family IPv4 unicast. Then I assign the VRFs to the interfaces. Interface ETH00 assigned with the VRF-A, and the IP address of this interface is 10.1.0.1. Interface ETH01 is assigned with VRF-B, okay, and IP address is 10.1.0.1 again, and also interface ETH02 is assigned with VRF-C, and the IP address of this interface is 10.1.0.1 again. And finally, we have interface ETH03. This is the VNet trunk interface, and as you can see, the IP address of this interface is 10.1.2.1, okay. And after that, we have the same configuration in the router 2. First, I configured the host name. Then I configured 3 VRFs, VRF-A, VRF-B, and VRF-C with VNet tag 2, 3, and 4. And also, I enabled address family IPv4 unicast for these 3 VRFs. After that, here we have interface ETH00 that is assigned with VRF-A, and also the IP address of this interface is 10.2.0.2. Again, interface ETH01 that is assigned with VRF-B, and IP address of this interface is 10.2.0.2 again /24. And interface ETH02's IP address, this interface is assigned with VRF-C, and the IP address of this interface is 10.2.0.2. And interface ETH03 is a VNet trunk, and also the IP address of this interface is 10.1.2.2. That's it. And also we have 6 VPC 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Very good. Now I'm going to first copy this configuration in the router R1 and router R2. And after that, we can talk about the configuration of OSPF version 2. Let me to copy the configuration of R1 from here, and then pasting this configuration to the R1 CLI. This is the R1 CLI, very good. And after that, we should copy the configuration of R2. This is the configuration of R2. I'm going to copy this configuration and pasting on the R2 CLI, very good. And after that, we have also 6 VPC. Let me to copy the configuration of VPC1. This is the VPC1, the IP address is 10.1.0.10. And then the VPC2's configuration here, VPC2 10.1.0.10 again, and again for VPC3 I use the 10.1.0.10 because you know that these 3 VPC are reside in different VRFs in different virtual networks. For VPC4 I use 10.2.0.11 for IP addressing VPC4, and for the VPC5, I use 10.2.0.12, okay, from here, VPC5. And finally, for the VPC6, I use the 10.2.0.13, okay, look at here, 10.2.0.13, very good. Now, let me first check the routing table of the routers. Only we will have the connected networks, show IP route for VRF-A in R1. We have 2 connected networks. The first connected network is 10.1.0.0 and the second is 10.1.2.0. It's okay. Then for VRFP, show IP route VRFP, again we have two connected networks, and finally VRFC, we have again two connected networks. And finally, in router 2, we can check show IP route VRFA. We have two connected networks. For VRFP, again we have two connected networks, and finally for VRFC, we will have two connected networks. Now we can configure the OSPF or some other routing protocols in this scenario. In this scenario, I'm going to configure the OSPF version 2. OSPF version 2 doesn't have the capability of ORF or of VRF. You should configure every OSPF instance, or for example, one OSPF instance for one VRF. Okay, and this is not good because, for example, here we have 3 VRF, and because of that you should configure 3 OSPF instance. Okay, let me to show you how we can configure the OSPF version 2. Router config, router OSPF. Okay, then you should use the PID, router OSPF PID for VRF name. This is the OSPF for this VRF only. Router config router. And then you should use the, for example, network interface IP wildcard mask, and then finally area ID. So easy. But the configuration is similar to the OSPF configuration without VRF. Only you should add one word, the VRF, after the router OSPF. This means that, for example, in this scenario, we have 3 VRF. We should configure 3 OSPF instance. Let me to show you how we can configure these OSPFs. In R1, first I'm going to configure OSPF1, router OSPF1 for VRFA. I'm using the router OSPF1 VRFA. This OSPF now is working on the VRFA. And then the network is the 10101, the IP address of the ETH00, quad 0, area, for example, 0. The second network statement is 10121, quad 0, area 0. Okay, let me to show you. Do show IP OSPF interface brief. As you can see here, we have ETH00, that is OSPF enabled interface with PID of 1 and area is 0. And also we have ETH03.2. This interface is driven by the configuration of VNet trunk on the ETH03. And you can see that here we have two interfaces. Okay, let me to configure router 2 with OSPF process 1. You know that the OSPF process ID can be different in two router, but I'm using the same process ID. Router OSPF 1 with for the VRFA. Again, the network is 10122, the IP address of the ETH03.2, and then area 0, and the next interface is 10202 quad 0, area 0. This is the IP address of the ETH00. Okay, now we have one neighborship, one OSPF neighborship between R1 and R2. Let me show you here. Do show IP OSPF neighbor. We have neighborship with the router 2, and also in router 2 do show IP OSPF neighbor. We have neighborship with the router 1. If you want, you can check the routing table of the router R1. Do show IP route VRFA. Okay, do show IP route VRFA. Now show us that we have 10200 received from the OSPF in R1 for VRFA, and also in R2 do show IP route VRFA. Show us that we received the 10100/24 with OSPF. Okay, it's so simple. Again, we need to configure next OSPF instance. For example, OSPF2, router OSPF2 for VRFB. Again, network is 10101 quad 0, area 0. And then network 10121 quad 0, area 0. Now do show IP OSPF interface brief. As you can see here, we have process ID 2, okay, for the ETH01 and also ETH03.3. This interface is driven by our configuration, you know it. And after that, for example, we can configure the OSPF process tree, router OSPF3 for the VRFC. You should configure for every VRF one OSPF instance. The network, router OSPF-C, router OSPF3, VRFC. As you can see, OSPF process tree failed to allocate unique router ID and cannot start. Let me to show you. First, we're using the network command, network 10.1.0.1, okay, quad 0, area 0, and then network 10.1.2.1, quad 0, area 0. Let me to show you, do show IP protocol, okay, do show IP protocols for VRFA. In VRFA, we are using OSPF1. And then in VRFB, we are using OSPF2. And then in VRFC, okay, look at here, we are using OSPF3. In VRFC, as you can see, the router ID is quad 0. This means that OSPF can't select the router ID. But in VRF1 and VRF2, as you can see, OSPF can select the, for example, router ID. What is the reason? Let me to talk about the router ID. You know that the router ID in OSPF is chosen by one of these three methods. If the first is that the administrator can configure the router ID. If the administrator doesn't configure the router ID, the highest IP address of the loopback interfaces that is not chosen by other process should be used. And if we don't have the loopback interface, the highest IP address of the non-loopback interface that is not chosen by other OSPF process should be selected. Here, we don't have the administrator configuration, and also we don't have loopback interface. Because of that, first, in router OSPF1 selected the 10.1.2.1 for the router ID, okay? And the OSPF2 used the next IP address 10.1.0.1. For the OSPF process tree, we don't have other interfaces IP address to selecting for to use for the router ID, okay? Because OSPF process 1 selects the 10.1.2.1, OSPF process 2 selects the 10.1.0.1, and we don't have another IP address. In OSPF, if one IP address is chosen by one OSPF process, that IP address cannot chosen as a router ID by other process in the same router, okay? Because of that, as you can see, the OSPF can't start in the OSPF process tree. It's better to configure the router ID with administrator. Let me to show you router OSPF1. In router OSPF1, I'm using router ID quad 1, okay? And in router OSPF2, I'm using router ID quad 2. And for example, in router OSPF3, I'm using the router OSPF3 VRFC, for example, OSPF3, router OSPF3, look at here, I'm using the router ID quad 3. It's easier to, it's the best practice. Show IP protocol again, look at here, show IP protocol VRFA. Now we have VRFA with the OSPF with the same, with the previous router ID, because I didn't clear the OSPF neighborship. Clear IP OSPF process. Yes, and then we can check the show IP protocols for VRFA again. As you can see that router ID is quad 1 in VRFA. In VRFB, the router ID is quad 2. And in VRFC, the router ID is quad 3. It's okay. Now we can continue the monitoring, the verification, show IP OSPF interface brief. We have 3 instances of OSPF that are enabled on the ETH00, ETH01, ETH02, and also 03.2, 03.3, and 03.4. That's it. Let's go to router 2 and configuring the OSPF. For router OSPF1, you know that we should configure the router ID. Router ID is 1112, for example. Okay, 1112, because I use the 1111 quad 1 in the R1. Then we can clear the OSPF process to clear IP OSPF process. Okay, and then for router OSPF, we can use router OSPF2 for VRFB. Okay, router ID is 2221 because I use the router ID quad 2 in the R1. And after that, we can configure network 10.1.2.2 quad 0 area 0. The next network is 10.2.0.2 quad 0 area 0 again. And also we need another OSPF process, router OSPF3 for VRFC. Okay, router OSPF3 for VRFC. Router ID is 333, for example, 1. And then the network is 10.1.2.1 quad 0 area 0. And finally, network 10.2.0.2 quad 0 area 0. Okay, let me to check the configuration. First, show IP protocol for VRFA. We have OSPF1 for VRFA with the router ID of 1112. For VRFP, we have OSPF2 with the router ID of 2221, and finally for VRFC, we have OSPF3. Show IP OSPF. Okay, interface brief. We have OSPF and the interface ETH00 for OSPF process 1 and ETH01 for OSPF process 2. We should configure the OSPF process 3 for the ETH03 also, 03.4 also. Let me to check the configuration. Show run section router OSPF3. Look at here. I should configure network 10.1.2.2 instead of the 10.1.2.1. Okay, I'm going to change it. Conf-t, if you want, you can use the router OSPF3 instead of router OSPF3 VRFC. Why? Because before you configured router OSPF VRFC, if you use router OSPF3, this means that this is the router OSPF3 VRFC. And then first we know I'm clearing the network 10.1.2.1 and then adding this new command, network 10.1.2.2 quad 0 area 0. After this command, we will have neighborship in the OSPF3. Let me to show you, show IP OSPF neighbor after some second. Now we have two neighborship with the router 1 in VRFA, VRFB. Now we have three neighborship. Quad 1, quad 2, quad 3 now are our neighbors. After that, we can check the routing table of R1, for VRF2 for different VRF. Show IP route VRFA. Okay, yes, we have the 10.2.0.0 received with the OSPF. Then show IP route VRFP. Yes, we have 10.2.0.0 received from the OSPF. And finally, show IP route VRFC. We receive 10.2.0.0 from the OSPF. It's okay. Let me to go to router 2, show IP route. Okay, show IP route VRFA. We receive the 10.1.0.0, VRFB, and VRFC. Okay, everything is okay. We can check the connectivity between VPC1, VPC2, 3, 4, 5, 6. From VPC1, I'm using the ping 10.2.0.11. We have connectivity. From VPC2, I'm using the command ping 10.2.0.12. Okay, yes, we have connectivity. From VPC3, ping 10.2.0.13, we have connectivity. And this is the configuration of OSPF in VRF environment or in EVN. It's so similar with the configuration of the OSPF in the VRF environment. And if you want router configure, it's the best practice that configure the router ID in VRF environment A, B, C, D. Okay, very good. In the next video, I'm going to show you how you can configure routing in EVN environment with the EIGRP.